Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam, Baba.
Are you ready for today's story?
Yes.
That's great. Insha'Allah, I am going to tell you the story of Prophet Musa alayhi salam today.
Who was he, Baba?
Prophet Musa alayhi salam is considered a prophet, messenger, and a leader in Islam. He is the most frequently mentioned individual in the Quran. The Quran states that the Prophet was sent by God to the Pharaoh of Egypt and the Israelites for guidance and warning.
Wow. Please tell me the story.
Alright, now listen carefully. The story of Prophet Musa alayhi salam. Prophet Musa alayhi salam grew up as a prince. The pharaohs who ruled over Egypt were very cruel towards the descendants of Yaqub alayhi salam. The descendants were known as the children of Israel. They were kept as slaves and forced to work for small wages, and sometimes even for nothing. The Pharaoh wanted the Israelites to obey only him and worship only his gods. This way, many dynasties came to Egypt and they assumed that they were gods or their representative spokesmen. Years passed, and a very cruel man named Fir'aun was the Pharaoh now. He hated the Israelites very much. He punished the Israelites at every given opportunity. He hated to see them multiplying and prospering in his kingdom. One night when the Pharaoh was sleeping, he had a dream. In his dream, he saw that a huge ball of fire came from the sky and burned down the city. The fire burned the houses of all Egyptians, but the houses of Israelites stayed unharmed. The Pharaoh was horrified. He didn't understand what the dream meant. So, the next day, he called his priests and magicians. He asked them about the dream he had. The priest said to him, "This means a boy will be born to the Israelites very soon. Egyptians are going to perish at the hands of this boy." The Pharaoh got very angry. He ordered to kill every male child born to the Israelites. Pharaoh's order was carried out, and the soldiers began to kill every male child born to the Israelites. It was during at that time that Prophet Musa alayhi salam was born. The Prophet was born to a poor Israelite family, and he had an elder brother named Harun alayhi salam and another sister. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had a plan for the Prophet. He ordered his mother to place him in a basket and allow it to float downstream in the great Nile River. Musa alayhi salam's mother did as she was told, and she let him float in the river. Her heart grieved for her son. However, she was aware that Allah cared for her son, and she knew that no harm will come to them. As the basket floated away, she asked her daughter to follow the basket downstream and make sure that no harm came to her son. The basket floated in the river for a long time, and the Prophet's sister followed the basket as her mother had instructed. Allah was guiding the basket, and after floating on River Nile for some time, the basket entered a small stream. The Pharaoh's wife was bathing in that stream, and when she saw the basket, she asked her servants to bring it ashore. When she saw the baby, she just fell in love with him. Pharaoh's wife was very different from the Pharaoh. She was a believer, and she was also merciful. She was longing for a child, so when she saw the baby, she hugged and kissed him. Pharaoh was surprised when he saw his wife hugging and kissing the baby. He was astonished as he saw her weeping with joy which he had never seen before. "Let me keep this baby and let him be a son to us," she requested her husband. The Pharaoh could not refuse her, and they decided to adopt the baby. After some time, the baby started getting hungry, and he started crying. The queen summoned a few wet nurses to feed the baby, but he refused to take any of their breast milk. It was then the soldiers brought the sister to the queen. "This girl was following the basket," they told her. Then the sister replied, "I was just following the basket out of curiosity, Your Highness." When she saw her brother crying, she was worried and she blurted out, "I know someone who can feed him." The queen agreed and she ordered the soldiers to fetch the woman that the little girl was talking about. The prophet's sister then brought the mother and she started to feed him. As the child was put to her breast, he immediately started suckling the milk. The Pharaoh, who was watching all this, was astonished and asked, "Who are you? This child has refused to take any other breast but yours." The mother of the prophet knew that if she told them the truth, they would kill them immediately. So she told them, "I am a woman of sweet milk and sweet smell. That's why no child refuses me." Her answer satisfied the Pharaoh, and she was appointed as his nurse. Musa alayhi salam grew up in the palace as a prince. Allah granted him good health, strength, knowledge, and wisdom. He had a kind heart, so the weak and oppressed often turned to him seeking help. One day, while he was walking in the city, he saw an Egyptian soldier beating an Israelite. When the Israelite saw the Prophet, he begged him for his help. The Prophet decided to help the poor man and asked the soldier to stop beating the Israelite. The soldier questioned his authority and said something that really angered the Prophet. The Prophet first tried to reason with the soldier, but he was not willing to listen. Then the Prophet stepped forward and hit the soldier with such a powerful blow that he collapsed and died. When he realized what he had done, a cold sweat broke out from his forehead. He said to himself, "This is the evil work of Shaitan. He misled me." The Prophet knew that it was a sin to kill anyone until he is brought to trial and found guilty. He knelt on the ground and prayed to Allah, "Oh my Lord, I have indeed wronged my soul. Please forgive me." The next day, he saw the same Israelite fighting with another man. The Prophet helped the weaker one and said, "You seem to be involved in fights every day with one or the other." The Israelite got scared and said, "I'm so sorry. Please don't kill me like how you killed the soldier yesterday." The Egyptian with whom the Israelite was fighting overheard the remarks and he reported this to the authorities. The next day, when Musa alayhi salam was walking in the city, a man came running to him. "Musa, the soldiers are coming to arrest you. Get away while there is still time," said the man. The Prophet knew that the penalty for killing an Egyptian was death, so he decided to leave Egypt. The Prophet left Egypt in a hurry, so he didn't even bother to change his clothes. He was not prepared for traveling, so he didn't have an animal to ride, nor did he have a caravan. He had left as soon as the man warned him.
MashaAllah, that was such a wonderful story.
I'm glad you like it, my son.
Yes, I am.
All right, now tell me, why did the Pharaoh order to kill every male child born to the Israelites?
He did so because his priests warned him. They told him that a child would be born to the Israelites and that all Egyptians would perish at the hands of the boy.
MashaAllah, that was right. Now tell me how the Prophet's mother saved him.
Allah commanded her to place her baby in a basket and let the basket float on River Nile.
And can you tell me who found the basket?
The queen found the basket and she adopted the boy as her son.
That's great. Now tell me why the Prophet had to leave Egypt.
The Prophet, while trying to save an Israelite, killed an Egyptian soldier. When the authorities came to arrest him, the Prophet left the country.
That was brilliant. Now that's all for today. I will tell you another story tomorrow. Good night, my son. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam.
Have you finished your homework, Amr?
Yes, Baba.
That's great. So you're ready for the story of Prophet Musa alayhi salam.
Yes, Baba, I really want to know what happened to him in the desert.
All right, now listen carefully. Bismillah. Prophet Musa alayhi salam hears the voice of God. Prophet Musa alayhi salam wandered in the desert for many days and nights. He traveled in the direction of Midian, which was the nearest town between Syria and Egypt. His only companion in the desert was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and his only provision was piety. The hot sand burned the soles of his feet, but fearing pursuit by the soldiers, he forced himself to keep walking. Like this, he walked for 8 days and nights. The Prophet finally managed to cross the desert, and he reached the outskirts of Midian. After walking for some more time, he reached a watering hole outside the city. As soon as he reached the spring, he threw himself under a tree to rest for some time. As he caught his breath, he noticed two women standing aside with their sheep. They were standing far away, hesitant to approach the crowd. The Prophet sensed that the woman needed help. So being a man of honor, he ignored his thirst and went to them. "Can I help you in any way? Why are you standing aside?" he asked them. Then the older sister replied, "We are waiting until the men finish watering their sheep." "Why are you waiting?" he asked them again. "We are helpless," they said. "Our father is very old and he does not have the strength to face this crowd. If we go forward, the strong men will push us aside. So when these people are finished, then we take our animals to the water. It's our daily routine," they explained. The Prophet took the women's sheep to the water hole, where he easily pushed in amongst the men. When he approached the water, he saw that the shepherds had put a large rock to cover the well. The Prophet single-handedly lifted the rock and he let the animals drink. The people standing there were awestruck when they saw him lifting the stone with just one hand. He then returned to sit in the shade of the tree. That's when he realized that he had forgotten to drink. "Oh Lord," he prayed, "whatever good you can bestow on me, I am surely in need of it now." When the daughters returned home earlier than usual, their father was surprised. The daughters then explained what happened at the oasis and why they reached early. Their father wanted to thank the stranger, so he sent one of his daughters to invite the stranger to his home. One of the daughters returned to the Prophet and told him, "My father wants to reward you for your kindness, and he invites you to our home." He agreed and accompanied the maiden to her father. When they reached the house, the Prophet introduced himself and told him the story of his life. He then told them why he had to flee from Egypt. The old man comforted him. "Be grateful to Allah that you have managed to escape from those tyrants. You need not be afraid now." The old man and his daughters really liked the gentle behavior of the Prophet. They invited him to stay with them for a few days, and the Prophet was more than happy to accept their invitation. The host soon realized that the Prophet was a trustworthy man. One day, the old man approached him and said, I wish to marry you to one of my daughters. The Prophet was happy to hear this, but on one condition, the old man added, You must agree to work for me for a period of 8 years, he said. The Prophet was a stranger in a strange land. Exhausted and alone, this offer suited him very much. He married the Midianite's daughter and looked after his animals for 10 long years. Time passed, and he stayed far away from his family and his people. This period of 10 years was very important for the Prophet. It was a time for major preparation. Musa alayhi salam completed 10 years of his service as he had promised. One day, suddenly he was overcome by homesickness. He started missing his family and the land of Egypt. He desperately wanted to return to Egypt. That night he went to his wife and said, We shall leave for Egypt tomorrow. His wife agreed and they started packing their belongings. Musa alayhi salam left Midian with his family and traveled through the desert. They traveled for many days and finally reached near Mount Sinai. I think we have lost our way, said the Prophet. The Prophet was confused, so he decided to camp there for the night. He then left searching for firewood to light up a fire. He kept searching and reached Mount Tur. As he walked, he noticed a fire burning on the top of the mountain. Musa alayhi salam walked towards the fire, and as he did, he heard a voice. O Musa, I am Allah, the Lord of the universe, said the voice. The Prophet realized that it was indeed God talking to him, and so he walked towards the fire. Allah then asked the Prophet to remove his shoes as he was standing on a holy ground. God then revealed to him that he had been chosen for a special mission and asked him to follow his instructions. And what is it in your right hands? Allah asked him. This is my staff, he replied, on which I lean and with which I beat down the branches for my sheep. Throw down your staff, the voice commanded. And no sooner did the Prophet throw down the staff that it turned into a wriggling snake. Musa alayhi salam was frightened and he started to run. But the voice said, Fear not and grasp your stick. We shall return it to its former state. The Prophet was terrified of the snake. He then trusted the voice and placed his hand over the snake. It immediately transformed back into his staff again. The fear of Musa alayhi salam subsided and was replaced by peace, as he realized that he was indeed talking to God. Next, Allah commanded him to put his hand inside the robe. The Prophet did as commanded, and when he pulled his hand out, it was shining brilliantly. Allah then commanded him to go to Egypt and face the Pharaoh. He told them that the Pharaoh had become arrogant and was suppressing the Israelites. Musa alayhi salam feared that he would be arrested if he returned to Egypt. So he said, O Allah, I have killed a man among them, and I fear they will kill me. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comforted him by saying, Go and deliver this message to them. Show them the path of the truth. Take your brother Harun to assist you. They will not be able to harm you at all. Allah assured him of his safety, and the Prophet was convinced.
What happened next?
I will tell you that tomorrow.
MashaAllah, that was such a great story.
Now are you ready for the questions?
Yes, Baba.
All right, now tell me, why did the Prophet escape from Egypt?
The Prophet had killed an Egyptian and that's why he had to flee from Egypt.
That's right. How did the Prophet find a place to stay in Midian?
The Prophet helped the daughter of an old Midianite to fetch water. That's why the family gave him food and shelter.
How long did Prophet Musa alayhi salam stay in Midian?
8 years. No, wait. It was 10 years. Isn't that right?
That's correct, my son. Now tell me the mountain where the Prophet found the burning flame.
It was Mount Tur.
MashaAllah, that was excellent, my son. I'll see you again tomorrow. Good night.
Good night, Baba.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam. Did the Prophet go to Egypt, Baba? What happened then?
You look so excited.
Please tell me the rest of the story, Baba.
Insha'Allah, I will tell you the story of how Prophet Musa alayhi salam confronted the Pharaoh. Are you ready?
Yes.
Bismillah. The story of Musa alayhi salam in Egypt. In the last episode, we saw how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered Musa alayhi salam to go to Egypt for delivering his message. The Prophet then took his family and set off in the direction of Egypt. They walked for many days and finally they arrived in Egypt. When they reached outside the city, his brother Harun alayhi salam was waiting for him. Harun alayhi salam was a prophet as well. He had received a vision from God, and in the vision he had seen that his younger brother would soon arrive to set the Israelites free. When Musa alayhi salam realized that this was his brother, he was in tears. Then both of them walked toward the palace. The Prophet had not been to Egypt for many years and he knew that his life was in danger. Nothing could have brought him back except the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Prophet could still hear the words of Allah ringing in his ears. Go to the Pharaoh and tell him to let the Israelites leave the land of Egypt. Musa alayhi salam now stood in front of the Pharaoh along with his brother. The Prophet spoke to the Pharaoh about Allah and His mercy, but the Pharaoh refused to listen because he considered himself as a god. He listened to the Prophet's speech with disdain. He thought the Prophet was crazy to question his supreme position. After the Prophet finished delivering Allah's message, the Pharaoh raised his hand and asked, "What do you want?" "I want you to send the children of Israel with us," answered the Prophet. "The Israelites are my slaves. Why should I send them with you?" "They are not your slaves. They are the slaves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala." This answer angered the Pharaoh. "Are you not Musa?" The Prophet shook his head and answered, "Yes." "We picked you up from River Nile and brought you up, didn't we?" asked the Pharaoh. "Are you not Musa who killed an Egyptian man? You are a fugitive of justice, and how dare you come and speak to me?" The Prophet ignored his sarcasm and explained that he killed the Egyptian in an accident. It was never deliberate. He then informed the Pharaoh that Allah had granted him forgiveness and that he was now one of his messengers. The Pharaoh asked Musa alayhi salam to show a sign to prove that he was the messenger of God. The Prophet threw his stick to the floor and it turned into a serpent. It started slithering and sliding along the floor. The Pharaoh was terrified at first, but he tried hard not to show it. "Ha!" said the Pharaoh arrogantly. "We have many sorcerers in our kingdom who can match your magic." the Pharaoh detained the Prophet and his brother at the palace. He then summoned all the magicians in his kingdom to the palace. The Pharaoh promised huge rewards to them if their magic was found better than the Prophet. The day for the contest arrived, and the palace was crowded with people. The magicians stood on one side, and the Prophet and his brother stood opposite to them. Everyone in the palace took the side of the Pharaoh, and the Prophet and his brother stood alone. Musa alayhi salam asked the magicians to perform first. It is said that there were more than 70 magicians lined up in a row. The magicians threw their sticks and ropes, and suddenly the ground floor was flooded with a sea of serpents. They were writhing and slithering everywhere. The crowd was amazed when they saw this, and they thought the Prophet was never going to beat such powerful magic. Musa alayhi salam was afraid too, but he knew that God was on his side. The Prophet threw his stick to the floor, and suddenly it transformed into a huge serpent. The serpent then ate all other small ones lying on the ground. When the crowd saw this, they stood up like a wave, cheering for the Prophet. The magicians were surprised as well. They knew that this was not just a trick, and that the serpent was real. They realized that Musa was not just a magician or a sorcerer. The magicians knew that Musa's power came from something greater. So they fell on their knees seeking forgiveness from Allah. Allah forgave them, but the Pharaoh grew furious. How can you believe in his God before I gave you my permission? He asked them angrily. But the magicians replied, Do what you wish, but we fear the punishment of Allah much more than you. The Pharaoh got angry when he heard this. He now realized that he had a problem. As the Prophet kept asking him to free the Israelites, his kingdom was built on the fear of Israelites, and everyone believed him to be the God. He was now worried that his kingdom was about to be unraveled. The Pharaoh felt threatened, and he summoned all the ministers, leaders, for a serious meeting. Am I a liar, O Haman? He opened the session with this question. Haman stood up and asked, Who dared to accuse you of lying? Didn't Musa say that there is a Lord in heaven? Musa is lying, said Haman. The Pharaoh then ordered to kill and torture all those who followed the Prophet. The soldiers then started torturing the Israelites. They slayed the men, and not even the babies were spared. They imprisoned anyone who dared to oppose them. The Prophet stood watching their horrific acts helplessly. He asked the people to be patient and asked them to have faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. God commanded Musa alayhi salam to warn the Pharaoh that he and the Egyptians would suffer a severe punishment if the children of Israel were not set free. The Prophet agreed and went to meet the Pharaoh again. He then made another demand to release the Israelites, but the Pharaoh refused. It was then that God afflicted Egypt with a severe drought. Even the lush, green and fertile valleys of Nile began to wither and die. The crops failed, and the animals began to die. Even as the Egyptians suffered because of the famine, the Pharaoh refused to obey and he remained arrogant. Then God sent a huge flood to devastate the land of Egypt. Villages were drowned, the crops were destroyed, and many Egyptians were killed. Then the people, including the chief ministers, appealed to Musa. Musa, they cried, please help us. We shall believe in you and your God if you remove this punishment from us. We shall let the children of Israel go with you. The Prophet then prayed to God, and the land returned to normal. The land became fertile, and the crops grew again. But the children of Israel were still enslaved. They were not allowed to leave as promised. The prophet asked them to fulfill their promise, but they paid no heed to his request. They ignored him and walked away. He prayed to God again, and this time Allah sent plagues of locusts to Egypt. The locusts attacked the crops and swallowed everything in their path. The people rushed to the prophet begging for his help. The ministers promised to let go of the Israelites if he would send the locusts away. The prophet prayed to God again and the locusts departed. But even now they didn't let the Israelites leave as they promised. God then sent a plague of lice, spreading disease amongst the Egyptians. It was followed by a plague of frogs that harassed and terrified the people. The people rushed to the prophet begging to save them. Every time God sent his punishments, they promised to free the Israelites every time. But when God withdrew the punishments, they refused to let go of them. Then the last sign, the sign of blood, was revealed. The water of the river Nile turned into blood. The water appeared normal when the Israelites drank from the river. However, if any Egyptian filled his cup with water, the water turned into blood. They hurried to the prophet as usual, and as soon as everything returned to normal, they turned their backs on Allah.
MashaAllah, that was such a wonderful story.
Now, are you ready for the questions?
Yes, I am.
All right, now tell me, why did Prophet Musa alayhi salam return to Egypt?
I know that one. God commanded the prophet to go back to Egypt for freeing the Israelites.
That is correct. Now tell me, what were the punishments sent by Allah in order?
First, God sent a severe drought.
That's right. Then
He sent a devastating flood. Then He sent a plague of locusts, followed by lice and frogs.
excellent. And what was the final punishment?
As a final punishment, God turned Nile water into blood.
MashaAllah, that was excellent. All right, now it's time for me to leave. I will tell you another story tomorrow. Good night, son.
Good night, Baba.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam.
How are you, Amir?
I'm fine, Baba. Will you tell me the remaining story today?
Of course, I will tell you the remaining story of Prophet Musa alayhi salam. Now, where did we stop yesterday?
You told me till how God sent the final sign to the people of Egypt.
And what was that?
It was a sign of blood. God turned Nile water into blood.
That's very good. Insha'Allah, I will start from there. Listen carefully. Bismillah. The story of Exodus. The Egyptians refused to believe in Allah in spite of the miracles that Musa alayhi salam performed. God sent his punishments repeatedly, and the people would appeal to Musa alayhi salam, promising to release Israelites. But time and again they broke their promises. Finally, God withdrew his mercy and gave order for Musa to lead his people out of Egypt. The people carried their jewels and their other belongings with them. This mass migration was later known as Exodus. In the darkness of the night, the Prophet led his people towards the Red Sea. By now, Pharaoh realized that the Israelites had left the city. He got really angry and he assembled an army to follow and capture the Israelites. By early morning, the Israelites had reached the Red Sea. When the prophet looked back, he could see the army getting closer and closer. He realized that they were soon going to get trapped. In front of them was the Red Sea, and to their back was the Pharaoh's army. Fear and panic began to spread through the people. Musa alayhi salam walked towards the edge of the Red Sea and looked out at the horizon. It was then that Yusha alayhi salam turned to the Prophet and asked, "In front of us is this impassable barrier, the sea, and our enemy is approaching from behind. Surely death cannot be avoided." But the Prophet did not panic. He stood silently and waited for God to keep his promise to free the children of Israel. At that moment, Allah commanded the Prophet to strike the sea with his staff. Musa alayhi salam did as he was commanded. A fierce wind began to blow. The sea began to swirl and spin. And suddenly the sea parted, revealing a path for the people to walk. It was a miracle! The Prophet then led his people across the sea. As they walked, the waves stood like a mountain on each side. The Prophet ensured that everyone crossed the sea safely. When he looked back, he could see the Pharaoh and his men approaching. The Pharaoh and his army had seen the miracle as well. But the Pharaoh was a pretender. He wanted to take credit for this miracle. So he shouted to his men, "Look, the sea has opened at my command, so that we may arrest them." They rushed across the parted waters following the Israelites, but when they reached midway, the water came crashing on them. The Pharaoh realized that he was going to die. He shouted of fear, "I believe that there is no God other than Allah, and I surrender to you." But it was too late. The curtain fell under Pharaoh's tyranny, and the waves carried his body to the shore. When the Egyptians saw his dead body, they realized that the man they had worshipped could not even keep away his own death. They now knew that he was never a god. God had favored the children of Israel, and he led them safely out of Egypt. After a few days of walking in the desert, they got thirsty. God then commanded the Prophet to strike a rock with his staff. It was a miracle. There came 12 different springs of water from the rock. Each spring was meant for 12 different tribes. God did this so that there won't be any dispute while sharing the water. God also sent clouds to protect them from the scorching sun. And when they were hungry, He sent a special delicious food called manna. But in spite of God's generosity, many people kept complaining to the Prophet. Musa alayhi salam scolded the Prophet and reminded them that they had just left a life of slavery. He asked them to be happy instead and thank God for His generosity. The children of Israelites were broken people, unable to stay away from sin and corruption. They were tired of manna and tired of the traveling. They wondered if there really was a place called Canaan after all. The people kept traveling through the desert for days and days. They were walking with no destination, day and night, morning and evening. Eventually, they entered the Sinai. The prophet realized that this was the place where he had spoken to God before his journey to Egypt. Musa alayhi salam decided to climb the mountain, so he called his brother and asked him to take charge of the people while he was gone. But before climbing the mountain, God ordered the prophet to fast for 30 days. On the 30th day, God then asked the prophet to fast for 10 more days. After the fast was completed, Musa alayhi salam was ready to speak to the Lord once again. He then started climbing the mountain. The climb was long and difficult. Once he reached the top, God gave him 2 tablets. In which the special laws to govern the Israelites were written. Musa alayhi salam had gone for 40 days and the people grew restless. They were like children, complaining and acting impulsively. Among them there was a man named Samiri, who was more inclined towards the evil. He suggested that they needed another guide, and he told them that the prophet had deserted them. In order to find true guidance, you need a true God, he shouted to the Israelites. I shall provide you one. He started collecting all their jewelry at first. Then he dug a hole on the ground in which he placed a lot and put all the jewelry inside. Then he lit a fire. Samiri then made a golden calf out of the molten metal. It was as if they had succeeded in making a god. Harun alayhi salam, the brother of the prophet, was afraid to stand up to the people at first. But when he saw the idol, he spoke up. You are committing a grave sin, he shouted to them. He warned them of the consequences for their actions. We shall stop worshipping this God only when Musa returns, they replied. Those who remained true to their belief separated themselves from the idol worshippers. They stood along with Harun alayhi salam. When Musa alayhi salam returned, he saw his people dancing around the idol. His heart was filled with shame and anger now. He threw the tablets to the ground in his anger. He then tugged Harun's beard and his hair, crying, What held you back when you saw them doing this? Why did you not fight them? O son of my mother, let go of my beard. They were about to kill me. The prophet understood Harun's helplessness, and he began to handle the situation calmly and wisely. He called Samiri and said, Get away from here. You shall live the rest of your life alone. The prophet sent him to exile forever. He knew that God was going to punish them for worshipping the idol. So he chose 70 seniors from each tribe and ordered them, Rush towards Allah and repent for what you have done. He then started climbing Mount Sinai with the 70 elders. Once they reached the top, the prophet asked the elders to wait for him, and he walked ahead. There he started communicating with God. The elders could hear Musa speaking with the gods, but they could not see him. The prophet returned after some time, and the elders told him, O Musa, we shall never believe in you until we see Allah ourselves. Their stubborn demand was rewarded with punishing thunderbolts and an earthquake that killed all of them instantly. The prophet was very sad now. He wondered what he would say to the children of Israelites. Those 70 men were the best of the people. So he turned to God and prayed for forgiveness. Allah heard his prayers and he raised the dead people back to life. The children of Israel wandered in the desert for many years. The prophet suffered greatly because of the ignorance of his people. He suffered everything for the sake of his people. God never let them reach the promised land because of the sins committed by the Israelites. After a few years, Prophet Harun alayhi salam died while they were wandering in the desert. When the time of death for Musa alayhi salam arrived, the angel of death was sent to the Prophet. When the angel came to the Prophet, he slapped him on the eye. The angel returned to Lord and said, "You had sent me to a slave who didn't want to die." Then Allah said, "Return to him now. When you meet him, ask him to put his hand on the back of an ox. Tell him that for every hair that comes under his arm, he will be granted 1 year of life." The angel returned to the Prophet and gave him Allah's message. "What will happen after that?" "Death," said the angel. "Then let it come now," replied the Prophet. The Prophet then requested Allah to let him die close to the Holy Land so that he could at least see it from a distance. Allah granted his request and he died shortly after. Prophet Musa alayhi salam, the one to whom Allah spoke directly, met his death with a contented soul and a faithful heart.
MashaAllah, that was such an amazing story.
The story of Prophet Musa alayhi salam was really inspiring, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, Baba.
Now shall I start asking you a few questions? Why did the Prophet leave Egypt along with the Israelites?
The Egyptians never heeded the Prophet's request to free the Israelites, in spite of the miracles he performed. That's why he had to leave Egypt.
How did the Pharaoh die?
God parted the Red Sea for the Prophet and the Israelites. But when the Pharaoh entered the river, the water came crashing down on him.
Very good, my son. Now tell me what was written on the tablets that God gave the Prophet.
God gave him 2 tablets in which the special laws to govern the Israelites were written.
MashaAllah, that was the right answer. That's all for today, my son. I will tell you another story tomorrow. Good night, my son.
Good night, Baba.